The silence was the cruelest sound. The front door of the house, her house, stood wide open, a gaping wound revealing the vast emptiness within. The rooms that had once echoed with the laughter of her daughter and the warm, deep voice of her husband were now just hollow, echoing chambers. The last of their furniture was being loaded onto a moving truck, each piece a ghost of a life that was no longer hers. Claire stood on the perfectly manicured lawn, holding the small, trembling hand of her 10-year-old daughter, Grace. The final eviction notice, a single, cold sheet of paper, felt heavier than a tombstone in her other hand. She saw him then. Richard, her husband's business partner, the man who had been at their wedding, who Grace called Uncle, was slipping into the driver's seat of his sleek black Mercedes. A desperate, primal surge of hope, or perhaps just sheer disbelief, propelled her forward. "Richard, please," she begged, her voice cracking as she reached his car window. "We were family. There has to be something you can do. Alone. Some time." Richard didn't even have the decency to look at her. His gaze remained fixed on the road ahead, his handsome face a mask of cold, impenetrable indifference. "Business is business, Claire," he said, his voice as smooth and sterile as polished glass. "Ethan made bad choices." He turned the key. The engine purred to life, a low, predatory growl that drowned out the sound of Claire's breaking heart. He pulled away from the curb without a backward glance, leaving her alone in the wreckage of a life built on lies, a life that had just been repossessed. Have you ever lost everything in the blink of an eye? Not just the things you own, but the very story of your life, the future you believed was yours? Today's story is about Claire, a woman who, in the wake of a devastating tragedy, discovers that the perfect life she had was a beautiful, fragile lie. Abandoned by a friend and buried in a mountain of debt, she is left with nothing but her young daughter and a past she no longer recognizes. But this is not a story about loss. It is a story about what we find when we are forced to start over from nothing. It is about the discovery that sometimes our greatest strength is hidden in our deepest pain, waiting for a chance to be seen. If you believe that a broken heart can become a canvas for a masterpiece, then join our community. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and let's explore how the darkest colors can be used to paint the most brilliant new beginning. Just 6 weeks before, Claire's life had been a masterpiece of quiet, suburban perfection. Her world was a sun-drenched kitchen smelling of freshly baked bread, a garden filled with vibrant, fragrant roses, and the easy, comfortable love of her husband, Ethan. Ethan was her rock, a charismatic and brilliant architect whose ambition was matched only by his devotion to her and Grace. He was the architect of their beautiful life, and Claire was its happy, unsuspecting inhabitant. The future seemed to stretch before them, a long, sunlit road paved with certainty and love. But there had been signs, small, almost imperceptible cracks in the perfect facade that she had chosen to ignore. There were the late-night phone calls Ethan would take in his study, his voice a low, urgent whisper. There was the new, nervous tension in his shoulders, the way he would stare out the window for long, silent moments, a look of haunted worry in his eyes. When she would ask if everything was all right, he would just smile, a little too brightly, and tell her not to worry, that it was just the pressure of a big project at work. And she had believed him, because believing him was easier, safer, than considering the alternative. The storm broke on a Tuesday. A police officer at the door, a few quiet, brutal words about a car accident, a rain-slicked road, and just like that, Ethan was gone. The grief was a physical, crushing weight, a suffocating fog that filled every room of their once happy home. But the grief was only the beginning of the storm. A week after the funeral, as Claire was trying to navigate the suffocating bureaucracy of death, she began her search for their financial paperwork. She went into Ethan's home office, a room she had rarely entered, and found a locked box hidden in the back of his closet. Inside, she did not find the life insurance policies or the investment statements she was looking for. She found the truth. It was a mountain of paper, a testament to a secret life of desperation. There were letters from banks threatening foreclosure. There were statements from high-interest lenders, the balances terrifyingly high. There were warnings from the IRS. She saw that Ethan, in a desperate, frantic attempt to save his failing business, had not just gambled with his own money, he had gambled with theirs. He had taken out a second mortgage mortgage on their home, used their savings, their daughter's college fund, everything as collateral for a series of reckless business deals, all without telling her. The life she had been living, the beautiful, secure world she thought was hers, had been a fragile house of cards, and it was now collapsing piece by piece all around her. The collapse was swift and merciless. The numbers in the hidden box were not just figures on a page. They were vultures, circling and then descending upon the carcass of Claire's life. The bank repossessed the house. The car was towed away. The savings account, the one she had so diligently contributed to for years, was a hollowed-out shell, emptied to pay off the most aggressive of Ethan's creditors. Claire, the woman who had hosted elegant dinner parties and volunteered at the city's art museum, was now a refugee in her own life, a woman with a master's degree in architecture and less than $1,000 to her name. Her only priority was Grace. She had to keep a roof over her daughter's head, a promise that felt more impossible with each passing day. With the last of the money she received from selling her wedding ring and a few pieces of heirloom jewelry, she made a purchase that was a symbol of her spectacular fall from grace. She bought a trailer. It was a 20-year-old rust-eaten model that smelled of mildew and regret, parked in a run-down, forgotten lot at the edge of town. The first night in the trailer was a descent into a new kind of cold. The thin metal walls offered little protection from the biting autumn wind. The space was so cramped they could barely move without bumping into each other, the silence between them thick with unspoken fear. Claire tried to be brave for her daughter, to pretend this was a kind of adventure. But later that night, long after she thought Grace was asleep, she heard a small, muffled sound from the other end of the trailer. It was the sound of her daughter, her brave, resilient daughter, crying softly into her pillow. The sound was a dagger in Claire's heart, a devastating testament to her own failure. In the dead of night, unable to sleep, Claire rummaged through the few boxes of memories she had managed to salvage from their old life. Tucked away in the bottom of one was a small cedar-lined chest, the only thing she had left from her grandmother Rose. She opened it, the familiar scent of cedar and old paper, a ghost from a happier time. Inside were not jewels or valuables, but her grandmother's old art supplies, a set of worn-out brushes, a few tubes of dried-up oil paints, and a small leather-bound diary. She opened the diary. On the first page in her grandmother's elegant, looping script was a single, powerful sentence. When words fail, colors speak. Claire stared at the words, a message from a past she had almost forgotten. She had been a talented painter in her youth, her passion for art a bright, burning flame before the practical demands of an architectural career had extinguished it. She reached into the chest and her fingers closed around the smooth, familiar wood of a paintbrush. A forgotten, long-dormant part of her soul began to stir. The act of painting was at first an act of desperation. In the cramped, cold confines of the trailer, with Grace at school, Claire needed an escape from the suffocating reality of her new life. She used the last of her money to buy a few cheap canvases and some new tubes of paint. Her first attempts were a raw, chaotic explosion of emotion. She did not paint landscapes or portraits, she painted her grief. The canvases were a maelstrom of dark, angry colors, deep, bruised purples, furious slashes of black, the cold, unforgiving gray of a stormy sea. She painted with a frantic, desperate energy, her hands, once so precise in drafting architectural plans, now moving with a raw, untamed power. The paintings were not beautiful, but they were honest. They were a visual scream, a way to bleed the pain and the rage out of her system and onto the canvas. But slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, something began to change. As she worked through the initial violent storm of her grief, a new feeling began to emerge, a quiet, fragile flicker of hope, and with it, new colors began to appear on her canvases. In the middle of a dark, turbulent landscape, a single, defiant splash of brilliant sunflower yellow would appear. In a sea of chaotic, angry brushstrokes, a small, calm patch of serene, sky blue would emerge. She was not just painting her pain anymore, she was painting her way through it. The colors were speaking, just as her grandmother's diary had promised. They were telling a story of resilience, of a light that refused to be extinguished by the darkness. With her meager savings dwindling to almost nothing, a new, terrifying, and exhilarating idea began to take root. Her architectural career was a ghost, her resume now meaningless. But here, in this small, growing stack of canvases, was something she had created from the wreckage of her life. It was a long shot, a desperate, foolish gamble, but it was the only shot she had. One morning, with her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and resolve, she loaded her canvases into a small, rickety wagon she had bought at a thrift store. She pulled it to a busy avenue on the more affluent side of town, a place where people with disposable income might pass. She found an empty spot on the sidewalk, set up a small folding easel, and leaned her paintings against the brick wall of a building. At the bottom, she placed a small hand-painted cardboard sign. It didn't list a price. It simply said, "Art from a Broken Heart." The first few days were a masterclass in humiliation. Claire stood by her makeshift gallery, a ghost on the bustling sidewalk, her vibrant paintings a silent scream that no one seemed to hear. People rushed past, their eyes fixed on their phones, their faces a mask of urban indifference. They saw not an artist, but a beggar, another piece of the city's inconvenient human scenery. A few would cast a fleeting, pitying glance in her direction. A group of teenagers laughed, one of them pointing at her sign. "Art from a broken heart," he sneered. "More like art from a broke artist." Each dismissive glance, each averted gaze, was a small, sharp paper cut on her already wounded soul. She was ready to give up 100 times. Every evening, she would pack up her unsold canvases, the weight of their failure a heavy, physical burden as she pulled the wagon back to the trailer park. But then she would see Grace's face, her daughter's brave, hopeful smile, and she would find the strength to do it all again the next day. She began to see the daily ritual not as a humiliation, but as an act of defiance. She was still here. She was not broken. And her art, she realized, was becoming a reflection of that resilience. The dark, chaotic colors of her early work were slowly being replaced by a brighter, more defiant palette. Her pain was still there, but it was now interwoven with a powerful, undeniable thread of hope. The turning point came on a cold, gray afternoon in her second week. A sleek black luxury car, the kind that usually sped past without a second glance, slowed and pulled over to the curb. A woman stepped out. She was older, impeccably dressed, her silver hair cut in a sharp, elegant bob. She radiated an aura of quiet, confident power. This was Vivian, the owner of the city's most prestigious art gallery. She did not look at Claire. Her eyes were fixed on one painting in particular. It was a canvas dominated by a dark, swirling storm of grays and blues, but in the very center, a single, defiant, almost impossibly bright yellow sunflower was pushing its way towards a sliver of light. Vivian stood before the painting for a long, silent moment, her expression unreadable. Then she turned to Claire. "How much?" she asked, her voice a low, cultured murmur. Claire, stunned, stammered a price that was probably too low. The woman didn't haggle. She simply opened her purse and paid in crisp, clean bills. As she was about to leave, she turned back and handed Claire a small, elegant business card. "Your pain is palpable," Vivian said, her gaze sharp and perceptive. "But your hope is stronger. That is a very rare, very powerful combination. The world needs to see this." She got back into her car and drove away. Claire stared at the business card in her trembling hand. It felt heavier, more valuable than the cash in her pocket. It was not just a sale. It was validation. It was a key. It was a chance. The business card was a key that unlocked a world Claire thought she had lost forever. With a courage she didn't know she possessed, she called the number. Vivian, true to her word, invited her to the gallery. It was a space of clean white walls, polished concrete floors, and a reverent cathedral-like silence. But Vivian was not a priestess of the abstract. She was a sharp, compassionate businesswoman. She saw in Claire not just a tragic story, but a raw, marketable talent. "Authenticity sells, darling," Vivian said, her tone both kind and pragmatic, "and you have it in spades." She didn't offer Claire a grand exhibition right away. She offered her a chance. Vivian began by introducing Claire's work to a small, exclusive circle of her wealthiest clients. She would invite them to private viewings, not at the gallery, but at her own elegant home. She would hang one of Claire's paintings alongside the works of established masters, and she would tell Claire's story. The story of loss, of betrayal, of a woman rebuilding her life with color and canvas. The combination was irresistible. The raw, emotional power of Claire's art, coupled with the compelling narrative of her life, created a perfect storm of interest. The paintings began to sell, first one, then another, for prices that made Claire's head spin. But the ascent was not without its own new kind of turbulence. The sudden influx of money was a relief, but the pressure to create was immense. Painting, which had once been a private therapeutic act, was now a profession, with deadlines and the weight of client expectations. The art world, she discovered, was its own kind of jungle, filled with whispers of jealousy and the quiet, cutting remarks of rival artists who dismissed her as a charity case, a flavor of the month whose success was built on pity, not talent. The most difficult part, however, was the media attention. A local art blog wrote a feature on her, The Trailer Park Picasso, a title that was both flattering and deeply humiliating. The story mentioned her husband, Ethan, and his dramatic financial collapse. The past, which she had been so desperately trying to paint over, was now being unearthed for public consumption. One evening, she saw him, Richard. His face was staring out from the society pages of a magazine, a confident smile on his face as he sponsored a charity gala. Reading the article about Claire's surprising success had clearly unsettled him. The final scene of the chapter shows Richard on the phone in his own pristine, minimalist office, a stark contrast to Claire's vibrant, chaotic studio. He is looking at an invitation to her upcoming exhibition. "Find out everything you can about this," he says into the phone, his voice a low, dangerous murmur. "I need to be there." His interest was not in art. It was in controlling a narrative that was rapidly slipping away from him. The night of the exhibition was a dizzying, surreal dream. The gallery was packed, a sea of elegant black-clad figures murmuring in hushed, reverent tones. Claire stood in the center of the room, not as the grieving widow in a rusted trailer, but as the artist, the creator, a woman surrounded by the vibrant, powerful evidence of her own resurrection. Her paintings, which had been worn in the cramped darkness of her despair, now hung on the vast, clean white walls of the gallery, illuminated by soft, focused spotlights. They told a story, a silent, chronological narrative of her journey. The early, dark, chaotic canvases gave way to the middle period of defiant, hopeful color, and finally to the newest works, vast, serene landscapes of calm, confident light. The exhibition was titled, simply, Rebirth. Then she saw him. Richard was standing by the door, looking profoundly out of place, his expensive suit a hollow armor in a room filled with genuine emotion. He made his way through the crowd toward her, a practiced, charming smile plastered on his face. "Claire," he said, his voice oozing of false sincerity. "Incredible, truly. I always knew you had it in you." He spoke of a new art investment fund he was starting, of a potential partnership, a way for them to rebuild the legacy Ethan had left behind. It was a brazen, stunning attempt to co-opt her success, to turn her hard-won rebirth into just another business transaction. The old Claire, the one who had pleaded with him on the sidewalk, might have been swayed. But the woman who stood before him now was different. "Thank you, Richard," she said, her voice calm and clear, without a trace of anger or bitterness. "But my rebirth is not for sale." She turned away from him, leaving him standing alone in the middle of the crowded room, a ghost from a past that no longer had any power over her. The climax of the evening was the auction for the exhibition's centerpiece, the very painting Vivian had first seen on the street, the dark, stormy canvas with the single, defiant sunflower. The bidding was fierce, a rapid-fire exchange between a tech billionaire and an anonymous phone bidder. The final price was a number so staggering it seemed to belong to another reality, more than enough to change her life and Grace's forever. But the true victory was not the money. It was the feeling of a circle being completed, of a debt being repaid not to a bank, but to her own soul. The final scene is a few months later. Claire and Grace are standing in the empty living room of their old house, the one she had lost. But they are not there to simply move back in. The rooms are bare, the walls a blank canvas. Claire has a paintbrush in her hand, and Grace has one too. "What color should we start with?" Grace asks, her eyes shining. Claire looks at her daughter, at the beautiful, resilient life they had built from the ashes, and she smiles, a genuine, unburdened smile. "Sunflower yellow," she says. They dip their brushes in the can of bright, vibrant paint and make the first bold stroke on the wall. They were not just reclaiming a house, they were building a new home, a home whose foundations were not built on lies, but on the enduring, beautiful, and unbreakable strength of a love that had been tested by the storm and had emerged brighter and more colorful than ever before.